Thanks, Anna, and Dr. Eckler. Nice to see you today. I guess I'll just ask for the next slide. So I think the big message is for the talk today. So if you have to leave right now or can't remember anything else, that with clinical trials, they're challenging. And so we want to be realistic, but also keep hope. So I think this quote from Martin Luther King Jr. is kind of a great way to think about that we must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. So even though there's challenges and limitations for everything that we're doing, we want to keep that ultimate goal in mind and keep moving forward. Next slide, please. So I'll be talking about different stuff in general today, and I don't think any of the disclosures will, there's nothing really relevant to what I'm talking about today, but just so everybody knows, involved with different research studies or consulting or clinical trials. Next slide, please. So what is a clinical study? So what are we talking about today? So the point is to try and figure out the answer that we don't know yet. So we need to scientifically prove something for treatment where we don't know the answer. And so a clinical study has no guarantees when we go into it. So depending upon the source of the idea and how much has gone into it, hopefully it's a good bet, but again, it's not a proven thing. Next slide. So why do a clinical study? So basically, without a clinical study, without all this hassle, we're just using snake oil. So the point of a clinical study is that before we try and give a treatment to a person, that we've gone through as much reasonable, rigorous kind of steps to make sure that what we're doing is safe for people and is also effective. So I can have lots of opinions about what I would wish would work for somebody. If you're not careful, it's easy to trick yourself or trick other people, sadly. And so the clinical study and everything I'm about to talk about, it's pretty complex, but it's there for a purpose. And of course, the rules are, they can have lots of burdens and it can seem like a big hassle, but it is important because otherwise there's a long history, unfortunately, in medicine and in other things as well of, seizing upon something and really thinking, oh, this is the solution, but without thinking it through carefully, sometimes you end up hurting people. Next slide, please. So there's kind of really broadly speaking, two types of clinical studies. One is a clinical trial. That's kind of the exciting one that everyone wants to participate in because it's the hope for new treatment. The other part is something called an observational study, but that's also very important as well. And I'll talk about both. Next slide. So what is an observational study? So an observational study means that there isn't something that's being done that's new or different. So there's no intervention happening. There's no treatment happening. But the purpose is to understand what happens. And this category of studies also includes what are called natural history studies, where we try and look and say, okay, what's happening during the course of a disease? What are the symptoms? When do they occur? How severe are they? What changes in the body occur? Does someone develop spasticities? Does someone develop breathing problems? Do seizures occur? And so there can be clinical symptoms that happen, but also there can be changes, for example, on an MRI. That might be something that we look for in a natural history study, or maybe we need to do a blood sample to see what changes in the body chemistry are occurring during a process. And the natural history study ends up being really critically important for knowing if a treatment is helpful or not. And so when we develop a clinical trial, if we don't understand what happens during the disease, then it's a little bit like flying blind. And so you need to know, okay, by age 3, everybody has seizures. Therefore, if we give a medicine and no one develops seizures by age 3, then it seems like the medicine is working. And so the natural history component of understanding disease is super critical. It's not very sexy or exciting. And we've had a lot of trouble over time getting various funding agencies to help us do natural history studies, but they're so critical so that we can, when we do a clinical trial with a new medicine or new treatment, that we know if we're being effective or not. Next slide, please. So a clinical trial, which has interventions, has different phases or steps, and I'll talk about that some more. And in an ideal fashion, if you want to go from like the first step to the second step, it should really be that because the stuff you've seen in the first step is good, and therefore it makes sense to go to the next step. It's super expensive to do a clinical trial, and I'll show you the number here in a minute. That means that it's difficult for just a single like researcher or investigator to do it by themselves. It's super expensive even for like a university to run it by themselves. And so that's why often it takes like a large group of investigators working together, or a big grant support, for example, from the NIH, or from a big company to have enough money and resources to do a clinical trial in a way that gives us the information to know whether or not we are having a treatment that's effective, or if we're just selling snake oil. The clinical trial also ends up being very slow, which is frustrating. So just the paperwork and logistics can take days and days and weeks. And then all the different pieces have to come together to make it work. The more resources you have at your disposal, the faster you can make things happen. So for example, I think we've lived through a huge clinical trial, right, in the past year and a half with COVID, where because essentially the entire world practically was putting resources in, and a tremendous amount of the scientific community was focused on this, things moved very, very fast. And even with moving very, very fast, it still took half a year from the time that is clear that this was a pandemic to having a vaccine. And I think we were all extremely fortunate that that happened so quickly. But with fewer resources, then it just means that everything moves a little bit slower, and there's not as much resources to make things happen. The science that we engage in, and sometimes you listen to like us talk about, is what makes a clinical trial possible. And so the studies that happen in cells or in zebrafish or in mice, even though those are kind of boring often, you're like, oh my gosh, like why are they talking about zebrafish again? Like that information is kind of the backbone where you think, okay, I understand the disease and I know which treatment we should try. And so it kind of lays that groundwork. And so you can imagine if you're trying to build a house, but you don't have a foundation, when you start to put the walls up, it's just going to fall over. And so all that basic science work is super critical for moving into a clinical trial. So it seems boring, it seems really dry, but super foundational work for this to happen. The other component for the foundation is also these observation studies. So if you don't know whether someone's going to have seizures, or you don't know what to expect for how long until someone has respiratory problems, then you don't have a comparison for understanding, like, is your treatment making a difference or not? And so that's why also these natural history studies, these observational studies, are so important for helping us understand when we develop a new treatment, are they helpful? Next slide. So why would you want to be part of a clinical trial? So there's several reasons. So one is that it's a chance to help other people with the disease. And so maybe the clinical trial will or will not work, but by participating, you are helping others who might be facing the same fight that you are fighting. And so whenever we have a clinical trial, we always hope that it's going to work and be, a success, but it might not be. But you have to think that my participating might have helped someone else, 5 years from now, not go through the same pain and struggle that I'm going through. It's a way to help fight the disease. And so, the real enemy here is kind of this, random chance in the universe where some of us get struck with diseases. And this is a way to kind of fight back at that unluckiness and hopefully make it not a problem, not for the future and the families, not a problem for people in the future. It's like, this is a chance to change the way things work in the world. And then there is a chance that it could be a benefit to you or to the person in your family who's affected. That's always, something we always think about and we always hope for. But I'd say that should be lower on your list of hopes. You should think that I'm volunteering to kind of make a difference. I hope it helps me or helps my family member, but there's no guarantees about that. Next slide. when you think about joining a clinical trial, but there's also reasons not to join a clinical trial. So it could be that the clinical trial is someplace very far from you, and you have to travel there, and your job doesn't permit it, and you'd have to separate from your spouse for half a year to make it happen. You do anything you can for your kid, but you have other kids also. And so, like, is this, is the clinical trial going to make such a difference that it's worth, taking on a burden to your other kids who are also, part of your family? Are there risks or costs to being in the trial that are heavy? So does it cost you money to have to do this? Are you going to have to take a second mortgage on your house? Are you going to have to give up so much time to participate that you can't keep working, you can't keep doing your job? Are there risks to the trial? Does it take lots of blood draws, and the person who's doing it just is needle averse? So there are costs, and of course we think, okay, if it's saving a fatal disease, we would, or it's your kid, right? You're like, okay, I'll do whatever. But those costs are real costs for participating. And clinical trials are such a big idea, such a big thing that we're usually very, very careful about doing a clinical trial and getting it going. But not every single clinical trial is the best thing. And so when you go into a clinical trial, you want to work with someone who can help advise you, like, is this a good idea, or should I wait, or is this not the best clinical trial to participate in? And so on the one hand, I want everyone to think like, okay, how can I contribute? How can I help? But on the other hand, like, if it's a bad clinical trial, that's not a good thing. Next slide. So who's involved in clinical trials? So if anyone's participated, you feel like you're meeting somebody new every day. So there's someone behind it. There's the money behind the trial. So oftentimes it's a pharmaceutical company because it does take a lot of money to run a trial. Sometimes clinical trials are put on by governments or universities, by individual researchers or physicians. So there's lots of different people who could be the sponsor, but it's always interesting to know, like, who is helping put together the kind of financial backing for a trial. With the trial, there's usually researchers, so for example, statisticians, people who do the math to understand, like, is the trial having an effect or not? The scientists who maybe help develop the drug or helping produce the drug. There's physicians who are helping assess, like, what's happening with your walking, or are your seizures less now that you're on this medicine? There's a whole study team associated with any kind of clinical trial. So there's nurses who might be answering the phone, or coordinators who are taking down your name or information. And so it's usually like a multi-person team involved in a trial. All these team members then have to interact with regulatory agencies. And so that's at the university level, at the federal government level, with the different sponsors, there's like regulations. And so all those regulations mean that there's lots of interactions among people for a clinical trial. And then for any clinical trial, there's something called a IRB, or Institutional Review Board. And so historically, this has been centered at a medical center or university. And the job of the IRB, which is separate from the clinical trial but oversees it, is to make sure that the study is safe, or that the benefits of the study outweigh any risks. And so that's, the IRB started back in the 1950s because what had happened is that there was, as you know, like during World War II, unethical experimentation occurring in Nazi Germany, and then also on human beings. And also, like, the United States has its own track record of things like what are called the Tuskegee experiments in the South, where people were given syphilis or had syphilis and then weren't given treatment, despite the fact that the treatment for syphilis was known. And so the IRB's job is to make sure that people are getting the best possible chance, the best possible treatments, even if they are participating in a clinical trial. Next slide. So the IRB is required for any research involving people. So even just taking a survey, if I do it, I have to get IRB permission. If I look back at old data about patients in the hospital, I need an IRB approval. If you participate in a clinical trial, you should be expecting that you have it explained to you, that someone walks you through the steps and what's going to be involved, and that you feel comfortable understanding what it is. And then there is a requirement that the IRB that the study has to get your signature, and those signatures and your permission to participate are kept. And then there's also usually an opportunity that if you change your mind tomorrow or a week from now or 2 years from now, that you can remove yourself from the clinical trial. These steps are really important, but it is a lot of paperwork. And so you have to think like, okay, for the study team, each time they do this, like they're having to enroll people. So it's a hassle on our side as well for all this work. Next slide. So I think it's become clear over time that not all clinical trials are being done in a fair way or equitable way. And we want to make sure that as we have a clinical trial, that it's fair for people. Is there an unfair burden on people who are participating? Like, is the potential benefit that someone gets from being in the study, even if you're paying it forward, is it worth the hassle and the risk? Or are they doing like 30 blood draws and you're left kind of anemic after the study? Another thing is that sometimes companies will do their clinical trial in a less developed country, like in a third world country, because they know it costs less, but also they can do it on people who have less regulatory protection than we do here in the United States or maybe in Europe. And so there's been some unethical situations that have arisen with examples like this. We really hope that the companies should be providing access to a patient regardless of what their race is, where they live, and that the studies are being offered kind of fairly across socioeconomic and geographic places across the country. And so that's also important. And then at the end of the study, a big question is, will the medicine still be available to those who've participated given their time and effort if it looks like the medicine is helping? And so this seems to be fairly standard now for most companies, that if a medicine is effective, that they'll continue to supply it to people who have been involved. But there's not always guarantees of that. Like there's a recent example, I think, with some clinical trials that have gone on looking at a medicine for leukodystrophy, where now they haven't guaranteed it for people, and they're basically requiring insurance to pick it up, and it's a quite expensive medicine. Next slide. So this is the phases that many of you might have heard about for a clinical trial, and we'll just kind of look through it quickly. So on the far left is what's called preclinical. This is the laboratory studies that develop the science that go into making a clinical trial make sense. And this can be, years to decades. Sometimes it can happen fast, but even for something fast to happen, there's been a lot of science behind it. So I think COVID is a great example. So we moved very quickly, not me personally, right? But the world moved very quickly into developing vaccines, but that was because there were, hundreds of years, 100 years worth of understanding how viruses work and how to develop a vaccine. And so that information could then quickly be leveraged into moving into a clinical trial. So once the science makes sense and there's a good enough idea for testing something, then, and someone has an idea where they want to test a drug, you move into what's called a phase 1 study, and that's usually with people who are healthy, and you want to just make sure the drug is safe. So does the drug cause people who don't, and it's usually done with healthy volunteers, and just making sure that the drug doesn't do something bad. So for example, does the drug cause your liver to fail? That would obviously be an unsafe medicine to use. And so testing the drug in healthy volunteers. Phase 2 is kind of an extension of phase 1, where you want to see what's the dose of medicine that needs to be used to have an effect on the disease. And so you have to give enough medicine that's effective, but you also don't want to overdose people. And so trying to figure out the right dose for the right person. And that's also still, sometimes it's done in healthy volunteers, sometimes that's also starting to be done in patients. Phase 3 is the most kind of exciting or sexy part, where we try to understand, is the medicine working? Is it efficacious? And so that can be anywhere from days to months to years. And that's where understanding the natural history is so critical, because if a disease normally takes 4 years to develop symptoms, does that mean you have to wait 4 years to know whether or not your drug is effective or not? And so a study has to plan to have enough time to know whether their drug is making a difference. Then at that point, there's that big blue bar. If you read it carefully, it says FDA approval. So that's the point at which whoever is putting together the study goes to the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, says, hey, we have this treatment and we'd like to have it approved for this disease condition. And if approval is given, then it's now can be sold and given to patients without other restrictions other than needing a prescription. However, as you can imagine, the first parts of the study are all with a few number of people, smaller numbers of people. Now, suddenly you're giving it, across the country, across the world, and suddenly there's many more people who might be getting the drug, and so there's still kind of a post approval part called phase 4, where you see like, okay, are there unexpected rare events that happen that we only know about now because we're seeing it, using it for many more people. And so that's also important to keep in mind, that even after approval, there's kind of watching people over time. So for example, for gene therapy, the phase 4 is something where we expect we might be watching people for decades, because rare events that might take years and years to develop could show up with a cancer when someone is 20 years after the treatment. And so that's something where we have to monitor people even decades after they've got that treatment. Next slide, please. So this is a example of a drug pipeline going from kind of the concept of a drug all the way to having it get to a person, to a patient. And it shows how you can start with many, many compounds. So that little yellow oval, you start with 10,000 different drugs you might want to study. And then the pipeline gets narrower and narrower. So you're kind of left with one drug that, if you're lucky, you might be able to bring to a patient. And if you look at the timeline at the bottom, you're looking at 1.5 to 2 decades, so nearly 20 years just for one drug. And the cost at the bottom there, it's about the average cost to develop a new drug is $1.3 billion. And so that's tremendously expensive, right? That's why this process is so slow and complex. It's extremely complex just logistically and scientifically, then the cost is very high. Next slide. So just to remind ourselves again of the phases again for a clinical trial. So preclinical, the point of that is, does the science work? Do we know what's going on with the disease? And can we intervene with something that makes sense? So like if you can't understand the disease, then you're just throwing pancakes at the wall. Like there's not much chance they're going to stick. Phase 1, is the drug safe? So can you give it to someone and not have them die or have some terrible side effect? So that's just making sure the drug is safe before you move forward. Phase 2, try and see if you can figure out a dose is going to work. And so you need some way to measure in the body if you see the levels of the drug that you hope will be effective, or if there's some sort of biomarker, some sort of change in the chemical signature, or on the MRI or something, to see if there's a change when you give a drug, so that you can see that there's an effect. And then phase 3, kind of exciting part, is like, is there efficacy? Does the drug work? Does it change the disease? Does it prevent the disease? Next slide. So the big kind of regulatory thing in the US and Europe, the big agencies are called the FDA and the EMA. And so for a drug or treatment to be given to a person, there's a governmental regulation, a process where there's an approval step. And so the big two really in the world are in the US, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and then in the European Union, the EMA, the European Medicines Agency. They have similar but different rules and regulations. And so it's a little bit, that's why sometimes a drug will show up first in Europe for approval before it shows up in the United States, or vice versa. Next slide. So for the FDA, I can't pretend to be an expert. It's like a complex, confusing process. There's paperwork, forms, steps, different meetings you need to have. The whole process can be influenced by outside things that are not driven by the science of the medicine. Family groups, politicians who have someone who are affected by the disease, big pharma can all weigh in on the FDA approval process. And there can be, if you think about the COVID vaccine, that had lots of kind of, risk of politicization. They tried to make this happen quickly, but of course there's concerns about a vaccine, there's concerns about not having a vaccine. And so all those factors weigh into the FDA approval process. What are the key issues that the FDA considers? Really, the two big ones they care about the most are safety and efficacy. Is it safe and does it work? Is it work as well as or better than current treatments? Is it better than no treatment? And those are really kind of the things that the FDA weighs when they're deciding whether or not to approve a drug. There's also different categories of approval that can occur. So, for example, emergency use. So, the COVID vaccines have been approved under an emergency use authorization because of the public health need for the vaccines. There's also a IND approval, an investigational new drug. If there's a experimental drug which hasn't had the same level of rigorousness that another drug might have had, but because the condition is so serious or life-threatening that it'll get an IND approval. And then if you have a disease that's rare, which essentially here on this call today, every disease is rare, orphan diseases, these are an orphan drug category. And so the government gives various incentives to try and make that process move along faster. And then there's basically kind of formal processes, paperwork, committee meetings that occur for the FDA to approve a drug. Next slide. So this is what it looks like from the FDA. There's a review meeting where the FDA meets with the drug sponsor to kind of say, okay, do you have all the paperwork lined up? Then a NDA, which is a new drug application, gets turned in, and basically, should have every little piece of information that's required, very complex. The FDA will review the application, and then there's a committee meeting where they'll decide, whether or not to move ahead with the approval or not. And that's why, I think we all heard in the news recently about the Alzheimer's drug that got approved, even though, how effective it is isn't totally clear. And I think that's where you can imagine the FDA is trying to weigh these different factors for the approval. Next slide. So after approval, what happens next? So then it's released out to people more broadly. If with a clinical trial, maybe 500 people got tested, but now in the real world, the drug might be given to thousands of people. So at that point, there is the risk that rare events might start to pop up. So for example, if the drug causes a stroke, it only occurs in 1 out of every 1,000 people, so that's not very often. So in a clinical trial that had 500 people, you won't see the stroke because you only tested in 500 people. But once you have 1,000 people who get the drug, then you'll start to see the rare events. Maybe you'll see that 1 out of 1,000 people who gets a stroke. And so you have to decide, like, do the benefits outweigh the risks for keeping that drug on the market? Next slide. So the conclusions, the take-home message is that observation and clinical trials are both important. They really tie together for making this whole process work. And so if you have the chance to participate in a natural history study and it makes sense for you, please do so. If you decide to join a clinical trial, work with someone you know and trust to get their advice if it's a good trial for you to participate in. It's still your decision, but having someone who can help guide you in the process is very important. Make sure you get details because you want to understand what you signed up for. Maybe it's something that lasts for a week, maybe it's something that lasts for years, but you want to know what you're stepping into. It is a chance to pay it forward, and so I really believe that it's a chance to contribute as a civilian in this whole process, but do so wisely. And then finally, we wish we knew what the future held. We don't. I think just being aware that most people are doing this for the right reasons, and we all hope for the best things. Next slide, please. So a couple of years ago, I had a chance to travel up to Missoula, Montana, and this is kind of the edge of town. It's, I don't know if you can read it, it says the Missoula Fire Sciences Laboratory, and it's the home of the smoke jumpers. And so we got to they're the people who get dropped into forest fires out, in the wilderness. And I think they're pretty active right now because of all the fires. And they gave us a tour of the facility. And so on the wall of one of the, of where the smoke jumpers are, I saw this quote. Next slide, please. It said, "Work hard and stay humble." So I think for all of us here, we hope we keep moving this forward and do a good job for everybody. And thanks for listening today.